Thanks everybody for coming. And I guess this goes into tea time a bit, so it'll be like a nice chill session, hopefully. So thanks to GCAP for inviting me here, and to Film Victoria for supporting me in coming over. It's great to be here and to be able to speak on this topic and share what I've learned in my time in the industry. And I was a champion for a lot of other games over the years, so I want to sort of pay it forward and pass along that knowledge. So I'm Nick Suttner. I'm a writer, a designer, and a consultant. I'm going to give you some background on myself first for a couple slides, and hopefully you'll see how it leads into the topic and everything, although it'll feel self-indulgent for a moment. So I started working in games at retail around 2004 at EB Games, and I had a lot of first-hand customer experience and championing games there as well on the retail level. So I would have customers come in who didn't really know much about games, and they'd say, "What should I play?" And I'd get to like hand them pretty much anything that I cared about and get them excited about it. And then oftentimes they would come back the next week and be like, "Man, that was amazing. What else do you have?" And that was like a really great one-to-one relationship. Sometimes I feel like in my career I've only gotten like further away from that like one-to-one thing. So that was my first experience championing games, really, and it really felt like being in the front lines of the industry. Yeah, so you'll notice this is a recent picture. On the top right is some art from the Shadow of the Colossus PS4 re-release, and that's my favorite game ever. And even at the time, I was really excited about it coming out, and I helped like garner the most pre-orders in our district for it just by like sharing that excitement and being its champion. And that'll come up again later. So, and then I moved to California in 2007. I got my first industry job writing for EGM magazine, which I'd grown up reading, and for OneUp.com, and that was my first cover story for the magazine, which also ended up being the last issue of the magazine. So I guess I killed the magazine, and we just used that like awful like in-game character model of Wolverine. It's actually a great game, and I'm proud of that story. Actually, I am very proud of the title for that story, which I had to fight with my copy editor about, is Insubordinate Clause. Anyway, so I wrote for EGM for a while. I reviewed a lot of games for those outlets while I was there, especially a lot of the seminal early indie games on Xbox Live and PSN. These were a bunch of my review excerpts. And I got comfortable championing smaller, more interesting games, and it came naturally to me. I'd done it in retail. I'd done it on a blog with a friend of mine. And I'll also highlight N+ and Braid, two of my favorite games, and I'll be bringing those up again later. So I moved to PlayStation in 2009 after they laid off most of us. I worked there for 7 years. I started in product evaluation, working with big publishers like Rockstar and Activision, but I was always happiest when I got to work with indies. And I was vocal about the games that I cared about, and people got to know me as a content expert a little bit, and as an advocate for smaller games. Ooh, this tea is like magma hot. So I became the lead account manager in developer relations over the years there, working with hundreds of developers, and helped make indie games a big part of PlayStation and what they were doing, especially leading up to the PS4 launch, along with the rest of the team there. And I signed a lot of games at PlayStation and worked with those developers to help them release their games and served as their advocate within Sony throughout the process, which is a really important role. And I will call out here N++, and The Witness, again, both follow-ups to games that I had reviewed in the press years earlier. These were sort of through lines throughout my career. And forging a relationships with those developers was mutually beneficial for me personally, even when it helped them in a business sense. And again, they'll come up again later. And then, so PSVR is on here. I was signing a bunch of PSVR launch games leading up to launch, and then was really interested in VR and ended up moving to Oculus in 2016. I worked there for about 14 months, again, advocating for smaller, more experimental games, and found out that a lot of the same challenges exist for developers in VR, like visibility, especially when most press aren't really covering VR yet. On the side, I wrote a couple of books on the works of Fumito Ueda while I was working those day jobs. And if you remember when I was championing Shadow of the Colossus at EB Games, well, it became my favorite game, and my book is like a love letter to it. It's in the Boss Fight Books series. And I used to have to tell people about the game one by one, and now I had a larger platform to speak from and to champion something that I loved. Now I'm a game developer. I guess it feels weird to embrace that, but I'm working on a bunch of different games, doing writing and design and such. And this is just a shot from a board game prototype that I'm working on that I think is cute. And yeah, so I've contributed now to Celeste and Guacamelee 2 and Escape as a writer and editor, and I've done a bunch of consulting and advisement work for various developers, including some that I worked with when I was at PlayStation, and working on 2 of my own games, one with my friend David Hellman, who was the artist on Braid, and again, that relationship sort of continues to benefit everyone, and even though I'd met him when I was reviewing Braid years earlier. So now you know a bit about my background. I've been a champion across retail and press and at PlayStation and Oculus and in print. And really, I think there's others like me at every company, every big games company, people who care about interesting, artful games, and that's across, console, PC, mobile, VR. There are potential champions everywhere. And if you only remember one thing from my talk, I think this is the important thing, is that companies don't care about your games. People care about your games. And I think that's really important to internalize, and I think that distinction is really important. Developers would often ask these questions. They would ask, will Microsoft care about my game? Why doesn't Nintendo care about my game? How can I get Sony to feature my game? And I think these are basically fundamentally the wrong questions. Really the right question is, who will help fight for my game? That's really what matters. And by the way, this talk isn't just for indies. AAA needs their champions too, and they have an easier starting point with these big companies, but they still need someone to fight for them internally and make sure they get the best support start to finish, and I've seen that firsthand as well. And I really believe that any promotion, support, or funding of your game happens because somebody cares about it personally. I think that's true of publishers, platforms, press, and people often refer to Sony's indie program, but there was never a program. It was just a bunch of people like myself who cared about indie games and wanted to make them a bigger part of the ecosystem and treat them like we had treated retail games for so long. And this talk really isn't about getting your game funded necessarily, but finding your champion is also the first step towards funding, so I think it's important there too. So sustainable game development isn't just about making your game. I think a lot of developers focus on making a great game and don't spend time telling people about it, at least earlier on when they should be. Oh. Back to Chrome. Oh, nope, hold on. Might need some more AV support. Oh, wait, hold on. Yeah, wait, nope, that's my notes. You don't want those. Where did it go? I am a Mac guy. Hold on, we'll do this. What? Yeah, there we go. I'm very proud of that, by the way. We'll see how long it lasts. Okay, so sometimes developers don't even tell their launch platform really that they're making a game, and they just submit it to certification, and it comes out when it's done. And a lot of developers don't upload a video with their game to storefronts, and why would a digital storefront be excited to promote a game like that? And unfortunately, games almost never do well purely organically. Sometimes people just don't show up for them, don't show up to buy them. And some developers think that just releasing a game on a console is enough to have decent sales, which is wrong. And sometimes games go viral, and word of mouth is enough, but you can never really count on it. The rest of the time, you really need a champion to help connect a great game to its potential fans. And once a game has a bad launch, it's much harder to get any future promotion, which makes sense because why would a storefront re-promote something that didn't make them any money the first time around? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how platforms work. My background is mainly on the platform side, so I'm going to focus on that, but we'll touch on press and publishers later. But all this stuff is relevant to working with them as well. So basically how platforms are set up is you have sort of the promotion teams, people who can promote your games. There's the storefront teams, marketing teams, PR and social teams, events teams that show games at events. And then on the content side, that's sort of third-party people, dev relations, product evaluation, account management, whatever you want to call them. It's sort of the same thing. That's where your champion lives. Typically, that's where I worked. Oftentimes, where am I? Content teams are typically the game experts, basically, again, across all these platforms. And people running digital storefronts really tend to be experts at running storefronts, not at games. So storefront people mainly want to make the most money every day, and they're going to default to promoting the most reliable things, which are usually big AAA games that are doing well already. So they will often ask, though, the content teams, like, what content should we be promoting this week? You're the experts. What do you got? And then the content team will say, hey, it's Dead Cells. That's like the cool thing that people care about right now. We are the content experts, so we're going to tell you what to feature. And this relationship is really true of everything. Events as well. We have an event coming up. What games do we want to show? Here's the games that you guys are going to show. And so really, these are the groups that are going to promote your game to the world. They should be doing most of the work. The caveat being that you can never really rely on these things. You should still plan on doing as much promotion yourself as possible. But they can really help out. And they also don't tend to create promotion from scratch, but they'll often boost your signal. So if they know that you're just going to tweet about something new in the game, maybe the official PlayStation Twitter account doesn't want to, tweet that news instead, but oftentimes they're up to retweet you. Just little things like that can go a huge way when they have millions of followers. Apple as well has a store editorial team. You should submit great assets with your game to them. They really care a lot about how your game makes their platforms look. Steam also makes editorial decisions, even if a lot of it's algorithmic, especially after launch, that can make a big difference. And those first few hours are really important to the game there. And all of these organizations really are just full of people, and everyone has their own tastes and likes and dislikes and priorities. There is a range of sort of skills and empowerment within an organization, and not everyone can help you as much as someone else. And sometimes you have to find the right person. And to be fair, sometimes as well, platforms are more automated than others and still ask you to email an alias instead of a person. But there's still people behind those aliases, and you can still do your best to connect with somebody. Oh, wrong way. I talked about this a little bit yesterday in a talk, but these were my priorities when I was working at these platforms in order. So my top priority was to the players, which is myself as well. Selfishly, I wanted to play cool games on our platform. And I wanted to bring cool games to more people. That's what being a sort of champion and curator is about to me. And then my next priority was to make sure developers had a great experience on the platform with us, and that I was able to serve them however I could. And then really to myself on my own career path and having a good time working there and everything else. And then to PlayStation. I was proud of their platform, and I was proud to work there and be a part of it, but I didn't really care about PlayStation's bottom line. I guess I don't know quite why I would, unless I'm invested in the company somehow. But this actually, I think, having their priority last sort of served them the most. And I think this is why we had a good developer relations team. And I'd hazard to guess that a lot of good, effective biz dev people in games have a similar priority where they really are genuinely looking out for your best interests as developers. So just as a side note, by the way, you don't have to be a partner title to benefit from a lot of this, meaning you don't need to have a formal relationship for exclusivity or something else with the platform. Even if you come out first on PlayStation and later on Xbox, or first on iOS and later on PC, a champion can still help you on those platforms. And oftentimes the platform will typically have less reason to promote you on a later launch of your game, but that can be all the more important why someone would still want to fight for your game and still have a connection there and someone who cares about it. And just as a side note as well, if a platform really offers you any money, you should take it, even if it's a small amount, because the extra support is the real win, and that leads to a lot of different promotions and opportunities. Just being a partner title sometimes, which can be a very small amount of money invested, sort of puts you top in line of the bucket of things that tend to get heavily promoted throughout the year, and that sort of really pays off exponentially. This is just reminding me to drink some water and take a break. So let's go through the steps of this, of how to find and maximize your champion. So step one is making the right game, which I realize is sort of a weird thing to read, and I don't love it. And what does this mean? Can you make the wrong game? And I don't like the idea because games are art first and product second for me, and I want you to make the game that you want to make. But it's also good to understand what you're making and its implications on finding your potential champion. And also this could be a whole separate talk and one that I would love to do, but we'll sort of cover the basics of this. So really, the easiest games I think for people to get excited about fall into one of two categories, and that's either something that is genuinely new. So just some, from the last decade, I guess examples: Gone Home, Papers, Please, Journey, more recently everything, Gora Gora, Getting Over It, or really something that's the best of its genre. And not all of these quite fit, but Super Meat Boy, Binding of Isaac, Hyper Light Drifter, Owlboy, Dead Cells, Axiom Verge. I would say for the most part they're not doing anything fundamentally new, but they're doing it really well, or in an interesting way. And if you're not either of these things, I think you're going to have a much tougher time standing out. The one thing I think all these games have in common is great art, great visual art, or at least memorable art. So that's a really important thing. And a screenshot really should sell your game. This is Inside by Play-Doh, which you've probably played. It's beautiful, it's evocative, it really makes me want to play it. Not everyone has 6 years to make a game, of course, so maybe that's not totally fair. This is Plug and Play by Eder Studio. Sometimes much simpler things can be equally intriguing. I don't know what this is, but it makes me want to play it. You should all play it, by the way. And their new game Kids is coming out soon, which you should also play. I'm sure it'll be great. And this is Prune by Polyculture. Sort of a less silly example, but simple, beautiful colors, really intriguing, makes me want to know more about it. And if your game is hard for you to describe, it's going to be hard for your champion too, and this probably means you're not going to be able to find that champion because it's going to be too difficult for them internally. So even if they like your game, it's going to make their job impossible to sort of take it to the next level. So Salt and Sanctuary, actually, let me back it up. I don't think that the best game pitches generally are, it's this thing meets this thing, it's X meets Y. I think that actually usually means your game isn't unique enough to stand out. However, it's still better than not being able to describe your game or why it's unique. And Salt and Sanctuary had a really easy pitch to me and a great demo, and actually ended up signing it faster than any game pitch we had had before, because it's Dark Souls in 2D. It's really clean and it worked well, it demonstrated that well. And your champion has to believe that you're capable of making the game that you want to make. So if you say, I'm going to make the next like PUBG, it's like, well, what is your experience? That seems unlikely. But if you say, I'm going to make the next Stardew Valley, maybe it won't be as popular, but with enough time, you can probably make something of a similar scope. And really, you should have examples of things. So even if you haven't made a successful game yet, having anything to show is better than having nothing. And really, your champion only cares about your concept and not how the game turns out, which sounds weird. But you shouldn't feel pressured to deliver exactly what you pitched initially. People realize that things can change over time. And it's really just that initial seed of an idea that gets people excited. Also, I realize I'm talking very fast, so I'm going to try to slow down. Knowing when to show your game is important. Tyler Sigmund from Red Hook Studios, who made Darkest Dungeon, reminded me of this, that knowing when to show your game is really important. Especially when you're pitching. And if you're making the next No Man's Sky, then you're fine showing your game at any early concept stage because it's sort of the concept of the game that's impressive. But if you're making something that needs to be proved out further, you should wait until a demo is ready to showcase the game well. And it's sort of a paradox because sometimes you might need publisher funding earlier, but you may be more likely to actually get it later if you wait to show the game. But that is important game to game of when you show it. And something else to consider, I'd say don't post programmer or placeholder art online before release if it's obviously going to change significantly. It might haunt you. If you're going to use placeholders, make them really obvious. Chris Hecker, who's working on Spy Party, told me recently that the art director on Spore would put big pink triangles in his screenshots to show clearly that it is placeholder. Because as much as people say they can look at something early and imagine, people are really visual by nature, so it's important that whatever you're putting out online represents the game. And if this image had come out pre-release, the game would have been a lot less appealing for people searching for the game. But of course, when you add art to it, it's Braid, and that's much better. So step one, we talked about making the right game. And sometimes your champion will find you entirely by themselves, but you can't really count on it. So step two is about making yourself findable. So you should go to events, GCAP, E3, Indiecade, Gamescom, Big Fest, PAX, GDC, Indie Mega Booth, Fantastic Arcade, Bit Summit, the Mix, Day of the Devs, and there's countless more around the world all the time. Go to events, submit your games to events. These are just a few that came to mind first. And when you're there, you should talk to everybody. Events aren't just an opportunity to meet fans and potential fans, but actually spend time with potential business partners. You can sell a few copies at your booth, of course, to people coming by, but the right meeting can unlock selling tens of thousands of copies. And you should talk to people who aren't just the business people at a platform. So even event staff or PR, those people can also become additional champions. So if someone from Sony PR loves a game, I'll have less work to do with PR when I need to go talk to them about it, or in the past, I don't work there anymore. I would always really take it seriously as well when someone from another department would tell me to check out a game, because as much as we look at stuff all day, we can't see everything. And maybe someone had seen something genuinely cool that just wasn't on my radar at all. So really talking to everyone who's there from these platforms or publishers can be important. And other developers can be your champions too. This is a really bad picture of the Indie Mega booth. You know, the development community is really supportive, and good things can come from just having casual conversations with people. And developers often share press lists and contacts and other helpful connections with each other. Maybe you can find someone to collaborate with, or connections with artists and musicians. And if a highly respected developer recommends another developer to a platform, it goes a really long way, and this happened with me often. Dan Edelman, who used to do business development and indie stuff at Nintendo, he told me that Kyle Gabler, who made World of Goo, introed Edmund, who made Super Meat Boy, to Dan. And then Edmund introduced Derek Yu to Dan, who made Spunky. So really a lot of these introductions come just from like, I've worked with you, I trust you as a developer, so I'm going to really take it seriously when you tell me to check something else out. This is another bad picture of the JW Marriott hotel lobby during E3. And this is actually where a lot of business gets done at E3, not at the show itself. And hotel lobbies and bars and coffee shops are all great places to meet people and have more personal conversations. And even if you can't afford a GDC pass, even just going to GDC and being around it for the networking, I think is really beneficial. This is actually a picture of this is a sheet of stickers that I peeled off my old laptop that had a PlayStation. And I still have this, and it meant a lot to me, and there's a lot of games I love there, and I have sort of a smaller collection now on this laptop growing. And I guess the point here is think about giving people something, a cool sticker, a business card with a code to download your game or your demo. You know, nothing big. You don't want to, I mean, it's very flattering when someone gives you like a poster, but I don't really want to carry that around for a whole show. But a small sticker can go a long way, especially if it's a nice one. And remember people's names. It sounds obvious, but you're not going to find a champion by seeming like you sort of don't care enough to remember their name. And always reintroduce yourself with your game name, and it helps for your champion to associate the two, because, you know, I need to keep things in my head straight of like who goes with which game. And don't be offended when people forget your name too, because they're working with a ton of developers. And even better actually than going to an event is going to visit their offices of these platforms. If you have a contact somewhere, go offer to visit them. It's always going to be worth it. Tell them you're in town, you'd like to come by and present you their game. I think they're actually really likely to accept. I was always excited to have an excuse to like not go back to work for an afternoon and instead have a developer on campus and go sit in the cafe and look at their stuff. And it's a much better context to see a game in, of course. It's going to be a lot more memorable for that person you're showing to. So I don't know if Rami's in the room, maybe outside, but yeah, you know, he helped put together Press Kit. This is a really important resource. You probably know about it. If you don't, please check it out and use it at the bare minimum. This is something that really helps you make yourself findable. This will help you get some basic facts up about your company, if you have one, and your game. This is like a pretty old one, but you can see just the Young Horses one. It's like they have sort of fact sheets and videos and everything very easily accessible, all the basics. Make sure you have your contact info listed online. That's really important. It sounds obvious, but it's not always the case. And a personal contact is better than a generic one. So if I have nick@company.com, that's much better than info@company.com. It might feel more professional to have the info thing, but I think it sort of feels like screaming into a void often. I'd rather be emailing a person. It drives me crazy. How many games don't have websites or a trailer online? Don't make your game hard to find. Make sure your name and the name of the game is Googleable. And if you're lucky, someone might be looking for you. And I do think that being persistent is good. I think it's better than being hard to find or hard to remember. People in biz dev roles get hundreds of emails every day, so I think checking in often actually helps. Just put your email near the top. And personalize your emails. Don't put people on a generic mailing list. And keep your emails concise. Put a video or a GIF, something moving for them to see, something visual. But also don't send out giant email blasts to everyone you know at a company. It can be a way to get problems solved quickly if you're stuck in the process somewhere of releasing a game and it's urgent, but it's not going to help you find your champion. I thought I had another point, not in my notes, but another point, maybe it'll come up later, but, actually, no, it will come up later, never mind, we'll save that. So if you can't go to any events or you don't have a contact somewhere, check on Twitter. Again, everyone is just people. They'll probably respond to you. This is my Twitter account from a few months ago. If people can't help you directly, they'll probably send you to someone who can. But likely, they're not just going to let you sit there and not get back to you. They're just people. So we talked about making the right game, making yourself findable, but you also need to give your champion the best tools to help you to fight for your game, and that's about arming your champion. So this is sort of some best practices in sending thoughtful demos to people. So Steam keys are best. It's better than a standalone build. It's just easier to access from the Steam library. It's not essential, but it can be nice. These colors are not great. If you have a dev kit already from that platform, send a build on their hardware if you can. That really shows that you're serious about the platform. Add controller support to the build if it's planned. The only game that I actually ever managed to not get signed at Sony that I was fighting for and failed to was a game that was going to include controller support eventually, but didn't have it in the build, and it just didn't really work and didn't showcase the game properly, which was understandable. So that's, if it's going to have controller support, make sure it has it when you send it to the platform. Make the build self-contained. Don't make people read separate documents. It's better to mock up a simple controller or instruction screen, even if it doesn't look great, and put it at the beginning of the demo than to have to go read a separate document to get the controls of the game. And send things people can share. Sending a YouTube link is always better than attaching a video. It makes it easy for people to share internally. And if you provide a private YouTube link, you can even track the views and see if they shared it. Maybe they'll even feel guilty that they didn't see it, and that'll make them look at it. And beware, I think, just as a heads up, if you're making a multiplayer game, that's you're sort of introducing a few challenges at an online multiplayer game. Because sometimes developers would try to schedule me time to play the online game with them to get a full room going. It never really worked too well. And also your champion is going to be unlikely to be able to show the game at events if it requires multiple stations. Because usually like one game gets one kiosk to show, and if it requires 4 or 6 stations, your game's probably just not going to get shown. I think you should research their platform. Be aware of any first-party similarities, meaning be aware of games that they're developing themselves, and be aware of any similarities with the game you're pitching them, because of course that's a no-go if you're pitching something that they already have coming from the first-party development side. Be familiar with their storefront. Just do some basic research. Use it yourself. It was frustrating when people would want to talk to me about how can I get featured on PlayStation Network when they hadn't really used it themselves and didn't even really know what featuring meant. And consider platform priorities. Does the company have a new peripheral coming out? Can you support it in a cool way in your game? That's sort of the ultimate ammunition for your publisher or your platform, especially if you can do it in a way that doesn't feel shoehorned. They don't want it to feel shoehorned either, but if you can support it, that's really helpful. And this is also true of a publisher. You should know their lineup and know their tastes. And your personal story can be as important as the game. So knowing about your situation, your team, that'll help people remember you. Do you have a unique development story or background? Your champion's going to tell your story for you when they talk about the game, so that can be important. So the story behind Axiom Verge was a big part of why I signed it, where the developer Tom Happ had a day job at a bigger studio. He worked on his own game at night. It was a game he'd had in mind to work on for years. And by helping the game, we could help him have more freedom to focus on the game, and we knew that the game would turn out great. But that part of the story really is what sort of made it an easy decision for us to support the game in a big way. And don't confuse this point with sharing the actual story of your game. Really, the setting of your game is enough. People don't really want to hear about the story when you're pitching it. They'll be, interested when they're playing it, but that's not important up front. And a lot of developers would ask me this: what are you looking for? And I think, when you think about everything we've discussed, I think people are just thinking about what gets them excited, so I think that's the wrong question. If anything, what aren't you looking for is a much easier question to answer, because maybe they'll have a lot of one genre already, or they know they have trouble getting certain types of games supported. And I think being very specific is better than being flexible, especially when you're pitching. Providing a specific budget and timeline breakdown, and not giving people sort of a menu of options of compromised versions of the game you could make. It's not like I would recommend not saying I could make this version of the game for this much money, but if I can get this much money, I can make sort of the full game. I think it feels counterintuitive, but platforms really want to sign the game that you want to make. That's the version that you're most likely to get funded. Consider shared goals. Every platform has their own goals. Again, with mobile, how nice might your game make their hardware look? Nintendo has a strong heritage of platformers, Microsoft with shooters and racing games, and Sony with art games. Maybe they have an annual seasonal promotion you can align with. Maybe they need to launch a new feature that you can support. You can frame the conversation that way. How can my game release best support PlayStation? So we talked about making the right game, making yourself findable, arming your champion, and keeping your champion is important too. You want to keep them all the way through release and then on to your next game. So you should keep them updated. They should always have access to the latest major build with new features and polish. It doesn't have to be a small iterative build. They should have access to your assets, your trailer, and your screenshots, and all your personal contact info, including your phone number. You should trust your champion. Again, I think they genuinely will have your best interest in, or they'll have your interest in mind, even above their own platform often. If they don't need to ask you for permission for small things, more opportunities tend to come up. So flexible and willing and trusting developers tend to get the most ubiquitous support, and people who can be difficult or precious about their games often just get skipped over to save time, even if it's a great game. So if I have a short amount of time to get an okay to show a game at an event as a replacement last minute, I'm going to ask the game that is easiest, or I'm just going to say yes on their behalf or something, versus having to go and fight with someone for a day or two of figuring out the perfect circumstances and everything else. So your champion might also need to argue with their legal team on a contract, and I think that's okay. You know, they're on your side really in these battles, and you should choose your battles. Don't push back on things that they say won't happen. Just accept it and move on, and trust it, again, that they're picking the right battles for you. And learn the organization and tools that you're working with. So don't just email your champion for everything. If they've introduced you to other departments, email those or mail those departments and then CC your champion. And like with Sony, you should learn and use DevNet. That's sort of the back-end developer forums. It has a learning curve up front, but that's where you can get your questions answered a lot more quickly than actually asking your champion. And that's true of all the big platforms. They all have their own version of that. And don't announce anything without checking with your platform. You might be excited to share things publicly throughout development, but don't do it without checking in first, because they might have an opportunity you don't know about to promote the game or to help promote that announcement. And always give them the option to debut news and boost your signal. They won't do it if you've already announced it. So if you've already tweeted that thing about your game, PlayStation's not going to retweet it later if they didn't get to break the news. And maybe even try and talk to platforms before you announce a game at all. Oftentimes it can be more fun for them to announce it. And it was less excited to get behind supporting a game that had already been announced than to be able to make the announcement ourselves. And of course, things like that unlock, announcing on stage at E3 and sort of the bigger opportunities, but that doesn't happen to games that have been announced already. I would say defer to your champion on your actual launch date. Don't just choose a release date and then ask the platform if they can support you. I would defer to them on whatever date they say is best. Of course, if you're able to line it up with a PC release, if you're sim shipping on a console and PC. But this will make you more eligible for promotions and support. And typically, platforms can warn you away from bad dates, even if they can't tell you why. They know, they see the whole calendar, they know everything coming out. They can tell you when not to launch. And really say thank you to people. Send them something nice when they help you with big milestones. It's really worth the cost. So Tom from Axiom Verge, who I mentioned, sent me a gift basket when we signed the game and again when it launched. And the Starwall guys sent me like a Starbucks gift card. Little small things, but like I'll always remember those, and they meant a lot to me. Nothing decadent, and of course most companies have like a gifting policy of what they can accept. So just small things, but that really goes a long way and helps establish that relationship long term. A friend texted me this pic when he saw my name in the credits of Guacamelee 2. This was more recently, but give people credit generally when it's appropriate in your credits. It means a lot to the people who help you, and people will want to work with you again. It's been mutually beneficial for me, and having those sorts of connections are helping me now as a independent freelancer. And as a side note as well, credits can be a great place to find the names of people who work at these platforms and publishers, people you want to work with, and then you can hunt them down online on Twitter. There'll be like a thanks to platform section, and then you get all the names of the people that can be helpful to you. So we can go on this journey a little bit of the process. Ooh, this is me. This is my poor slide replacement today, so ignore those. Let's pretend those aren't there. So this is Tina, and Tina's working on a fighting game, apparently. And Tina might want to submit the game or take the game to GCAP, let's say. And maybe it gets accepted, and then Tina gets to demo it here. And then Tina meets a platform person, and then Tina can email them. Or maybe she didn't get accepted to GCAP and has to tweet at them instead. And then she can send them a demo of the game and assets, and then hopefully get a dev kit from the platform. And Tina should supply her platform with trailers and screenshots. And then the platform will help release the game to the world, and Tina should say thank you, of course. Oh yeah, here's my Obama break again. So, more briefly, a quick note about publishers. There are a lot of indie publishers. This is an incomplete list. All of them have different priorities, different deal terms, different expertises. They also all have very different relationships with each platform, so you can make that a part of your research. Has the publisher you want to work with released multiple games on the platform you want to be on? That's a whole different alignment and compatibility that you should be aware of. And really, they all have something in common, again, that they're all comprised of people with different tastes, and you should think about them the same way you do your platform champions, because they'll have to fight for you as well. And they have the same key elements. There's making the right game, making yourself findable. This is just sort of a summary. Arming your champion, keeping your champion. And you should identify your needs as well from that publisher. What is it? Is it localization? Is it QA? Is it getting development hardware, getting help with that? Is it actually just like submission to a platform and pressing the big red button? Is it getting marketing help, or is it just getting money? On the press side, I reached out to my friend Brendan Sinclair, who works for gamesindustry.biz, for some press tips, and he's been a game journalist for 15 years. He reminded me that press like to lurk, and that if you post with the game dev hashtag on Twitter or in other developer communities, press are often sort of watching behind the scenes. And if a journalist has awareness of a game already, it's a lot easier to pitch them on something. And doing targeted outreach is important. Reaching out broadly to press really won't get you the best results. So what's interesting about your game? Is it the mechanics of the game? Is it the topic or the theme of your game? Is it your personal story? Is it your development method behind the game? These are all important things to identify. And consider the audience for your game and which press outlets target that audience. So Double Fine's Greg Rice told me that they targeted influencers and streamers for Gang Beasts, whereas they targeted Polygon for everything, more of an art game. And you can also target press who've covered similar games. And if you're making, a game for niche hobbyists, maybe you don't want to target games press, and you should find where your audience is. So maybe if you're making a game about quilting, your quilting game is going to be better targeted at a quilting magazine than a Game Informer. And do your research. Don't reach out to an outlet asking them to review your game if they don't actually do reviews, which happens more often than you think. Make people's jobs easy. So don't just say, here's my game, want to interview me about it. Give them the news hook. You could say my game is the first quilting game developed in Australia. And as a reminder, press kit's really important. You can add a statement giving people permission to stream the game. And every time someone needs to email you, when press need to email you to ask for something, there's a chance that they won't bother covering in the game if they're busy. So just give them everything they need. Give them every excuse to cover the game. Okay. So the wrong way to do it, mass mailings are not great. I would say reach out to writers individually. They're a lot less likely to cover your game from a mass mailing. Not being transparent is not great. You should be transparent. If you pitch two writers from the same site your story, let one know if the other picks it up. Being negative is not great. Don't pitch your game as a solution to a problem that other games have. I would find a more positive angle. Don't be a jerk. Being willing to express a strong opinion on an industry issue is refreshing, and AAA often can't do that. But bad-mouthing other games is not great. Not going to help you out there. I'll help you cheat a little bit. I can share these with you later too if you want. But these are some good starting points. The left one is a list of over 1,000 games press people that's maintained by an employee at DICE, and then the other one is a list of people, outlets, and influencers who have covered indie games before. So, in closing, and then we'll do some Q&A. Make the game that you want to make. But really, you need to find someone to fight for it. I'm Nick Suttner. I'll be here throughout the rest of the day and some of the week. Come talk to me, and thank you.